I always thought certain brands of lawn equipment were built in such a way that using them and maintaining them would be easy. Unfortunately, after looking at this chainsaw, I might have to take that back, because this chainsaw was not what I was expecting. So if I was wrong about this one, what other brands have I been wrong about? In today's video, we're going to look at this Stihl chainsaw, and the problem is I have zero information about it. Now, I've already made a video about this chainsaw, and if you want to see that video, there should be a link to it at the top of the screen or at the end of the video. But before I try and fix it, I need to give it a quick cleaning. That way I don't get dirt in places where it shouldn't be, like in the carb, fuel tank, or inside the engine. The other reason I need to clean it is because I need to keep my hands clean since I'm filming it. Now, I don't mind getting my tools or my hands dirty while working, but getting my video equipment dirty is something I try to avoid doing. That may not apply to you, but it's important to me. Now, while I'm cleaning this chainsaw, I'm going to talk about how I was wrong about it, and I'm going to talk about the other times where reality didn't match up with my expectations. Now, since I don't have any information about this saw, I need to make sure it's going to start and run, otherwise there's no point in cleaning it, let alone repairing it. Now, I will admit this is my first Stihl MS-170 I've worked on, so what I found on it really surprised me. So it's not really Stihl's fault for what I discovered, but I never really thought it could happen to them. I'll explain more about that here in a bit. Now, I was kind of surprised to see some dirt on this side of the filter. For those of you who don't know, this side of the filter is actually the clean side and the underside is the dirty part. But the strange part is that it's clean, well, sort of. It seems to not be sealing well, and some of the dirt is getting by it. For those of you who didn't see the other video on this chainsaw, I did put fuel in it and tried to start it, but I couldn't get it to start and run. Now, if I slowly pull on the rope, you can see just how much the engine is fighting back, so I'm very certain there's plenty of compression and it's not worn out. Now, since this saw does not have a purge ball, pulling on the rope is the only way to get fuel to the carb. If that's the case, I might be able to get it started this time after it not starting the first time. Surprisingly, it started and ran this time, so it would seem that I just didn't pull on the rope enough in the last video. Unfortunately, the engine did not stay running, so I'm guessing that's the issue it was having, and that's why it was brought to me. Now, I'm not an engine whisperer by any means, but my OCD does have a way of not letting me leave a good mystery alone. Now, there are issues I absolutely hate looking into, and I'm going to tell you right now, this issue of starting and stopping is the issue I hate the most. The reason is that there could be more than a handful of issues with the engine causing it to do that. One reason could be with the ignition system. There could be an air leak at a boot or at a gasket, but the carb is the most likely reason. However, there could also be other parts of the fuel system that would cause it to do that as well. So how does this relate to being fooled by the manufacturer? Well, one of the ways I can try and fix this issue is to adjust the carb's fuel screws, but come to find out this model doesn't have any. Now, this was first brought to my attention by one of the viewers who asked me to look into maybe swapping a different carb onto the saw that does have adjustment screws, which after some research is very easy to do and with hardly any modifications. The only issue is time, money, and of course customer wishes. In this case, swapping carbs was a real possibility, but in the end, I was able to get it working without having to go that route. Now, if my methods didn't work, then yes, I would have told them getting an adjustable carb was the next best way to fix it. Now, I kind of wish I wasn't able to get it to work because I think it would have made a great video, and the reason is having a non-adjustable carb on your cheapest chainsaw is a really strange concept. So how was I fooled then? Well, in a past video, I believe I told you that if I had to choose a Stihl chainsaw, I would have picked the MS-180, which is basically the same as the 170, and unfortunately that means it too does not have adjustment screws. But why? Now, at this point, I'd never heard of a chainsaw that didn't have adjustment screws, so I was led to believe that these two models would not be any different. But in reality, the manufacturers made it to where when the carb starts to have the slightest issue delivering fuel to the engine, that you won't be able to adjust the carb to make up for it, and you'll have to either service the carb or just replace it to get it to work again. Now, they know that most consumers do not do their own repairs, so that keeps their dealers busy with repair jobs. In the end, Stihl's most likely chainsaw they're going to sell is not serviceable by the homeowner and now has to be serviced by someone else, and preferably the dealer. I hate to say it, but that's just shameful. Now, there is still hope for you. If you move up to the MS-171 for about $30 more, then you'll get a more conventional carb with fuel adjustment screws. That means you'll be able to make adjustments to the carb as it ages and starts to have a few issues after a few years of operation. That means you could avoid a costly repair bill with a small turn of a few screws. So I have to take back what I said about getting the MS-180 and choose the MS-171 instead. So have there been other times where I've come across the same situation or something like this where reality overshadows what my perception was of a piece of equipment? The answer is yes, unfortunately. Now, there have been plenty of examples of manufacturers making carbs more difficult to adjust to help meet regulations. It's been that way on lawnmowers for a very long time now. But for string trimmers like Echo, at least you can uncover the screws, but it's not a guarantee that making any changes will even work. So aside from fuel adjustment screws, what's something else I've been fooled into believing? I think the first time I ran into something different was when I was working on a riding mower and I wanted to adjust the valve lash. That's when I removed the valve cover only to find out there were no adjustments to be made, and that's because the lifters were hydraulic. Now back then this really threw me and required some research to figure out what to do. So was this the engine manufacturer's fault? Not really, but the idea of making them hydraulic seemed a bit unneeded. Another unfortunate example of this type of change is the use of plastics in small engines, and I'm not just talking about the wheels, airboxes, cooling fins, and carbs. I'm talking about inside the engine and the transmissions. The first time I saw this was, of course, seeing the oil slinger in a Briggs engine. Now, was I surprised? Not really. It did make sense to use plastic, but it took some time for me to understand the reasoning behind it. To me, I thought a metal part would have made more sense, and using plastic just seemed like a way to save some money. After accepting that sobering fact, I then realized it wasn't just Briggs who started to try and replace metal parts with plastic ones. Even my favorite brand, Honda, was using them in their overhead cam engines. After that, there didn't seem to be any part that they couldn't replace with the plastic part. The worst part is that with everything moving to battery electric, most of the equipment you're going to buy now will be mostly plastic, so I'd just get used to it if I were you. One of the most staggering examples of this issue is the realization when you buy a riding mower and it doesn't come with a fuel shutoff valve. Even though it's been proven that installing one and using it to keep your carb isolated from the rest of the fuel system will greatly increase the chances of the rider starting each and every spring, and yet the manufacturers don't install them. But why is that? Because they don't care if it starts for you in the spring. Besides, if you didn't already read the manual, the chances that you're going to get to start in the spring is already pretty low. There is one other example of reality and my perception not matching up because of the manufacturers. This one has to do with certain fasteners that either hold the engine to the mowing deck or even a spindle on a riding mower. Most often, the manufacturers don't expect you to replace an engine. Instead, they just expect you to replace the entire mower when there's a serious issue with the engine. On some brands, the fasteners are designed to never come loose, so much so that when you try to take them out, the chances of doing it with some success is very low. Most times, one of the fasteners is going to break, and for those of you who haven't had this happen yet, it's only a matter of time before it does. But is that because they use too much thread locker on them? Nope. They're typically shaped in such a way that they're meant to cut new threads into the openings in the sump for the engines when they're installed at the factory. The same goes for the fasteners for the spindles. Now, I didn't realize it until I ordered a new spindle and realized that the openings for the fasteners were not threaded. That means you could either make new threads or use the same kind of fasteners that the factory did. That's when I realized that the manufacturers didn't make it easy to replace these parts on purpose because they don't have any obligation to do so. Another example of this issue was when I was working on a Troy-built string trimmer. I don't recall if it was a 4-cycle or 2-stroke, but what I found out really got to me. So it turns out the pull starter for these trimmers are very fragile, and most never last more than a couple of seasons. After time, the posts for the starter pawls either get bent out of shape or the tiny springs simply let go, and repairing it pretty much meant that you had to replace the entire assembly versus just changing out the parts that were bad. The problem was the cost. Now, the price for the parts was about the same price for their electric starter. It's kind of funny how the pricing came out to be about the same for either option you picked. It almost seemed like they were hoping to sell as many electric starters as trimmers. Of course, they didn't want to be too obvious about the whole thing, so they started selling an adapter that you could use on your own power drill for a lot less, but if you didn't happen to have a drill, their electric starter seemed like a better choice. Now, to be honest, I much prefer using the electric jump starter in the first place because I mainly saw the pull rope in the same way you use a kickstart for a scooter. What I mean by that is that you use the electric starter until the battery died, then you use the kickstart as a backup. So when I would use the Troy build, I would use the electric start as much as possible and only use the pull rope as a backup. Now, that example doesn't seem as bad as the others, but it certainly wasn't ideal to say the least. So are these purposeful attempts by the manufacturers to make sure the money keeps rolling in, or is there another reason? Now, I can't answer that question, but I do have some ideas. The first one has to do with, you guessed it, regulations, and that's coming from the top if you catch my drift. Now, that reasoning sounds good until you realize that not all the tools have been regulated to the same extent, so unfortunately my reasoning doesn't hold up all that well. So is there another possible issue? Yes, but this one's a bit harder to believe. It's an issue of licensing. Now, it could be that what you're working on has been patented, and that's why it seems so different from what you're expecting. Take the starter and recoil issues for the Troy build. It could be nothing more than a bad design that was rushed out the door, and the starter was ultimately incorporated as a way for the consumer to still have a way of starting their trimmer if and when the starter does break. So what about the fasteners then? Well, unfortunately, breaking them when taking them out might just be a nasty byproduct of their ability to cut threads in the openings when they're installed at the factory. They may not be designed to fail, it just happens. So is everything explainable? No, I don't think so, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on when working on these machines. So what's the takeaway from all this then? Well, all I can say is do as much research as possible before you commit to buying something. Unfortunately, I had my mind set on the MS-180 and I wasn't planning on doing any research, but I'm glad I waited before buying it. If I hadn't have waited, I wouldn't be very happy at all. So my question is, if you found out that the machine you were going to buy had a very unique and potentially expensive design feature, such as needing special tools, special skills, or something that was technically not serviceable by the owner, would you still buy it? For me, I think I would work around the issue, but for some, this might be a deal breaker. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.